Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Claire Montialoux. I'm an assistant professor of public policy at the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. Right now, I'm joining from Sciences Po in Paris, where I'm currently on leave. I'm excited to welcome you all and to briefly introduce today's talks before we get started with the presentations. Today's event is part of a research initiative developed by the UC Berkeley Opportunity Lab in 2021, aimed at generating new research on racial disparities in the labor market and public benefit programs in the United States. Through this initiative, we have supported a range of new PhD level studies on a variety of critical policy questions related to how our economy and public sector impact communities differently along racial lines. At the core of this portfolio is work I've been conducting with Ellora Derenoncourt on the US Unemployment Insurance Program. Ellora will be presenting that work in just a moment. But before getting into the agenda, let me tell you a few words about the logistics. First, today's event is being recorded. So for those of you who wish to return to the presentations or share with colleagues, the recordings will be available on the Opportunity Lab website within a few days. Second, the chat function has been disabled, but you can communicate with the panelists and presenters through the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll see those questions as you submit them, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the conclusion of each session. And finally, I would like to thank WorkRise for the support they have provided to me and Ellora, and to the initiative as a whole at UC Berkeley and at Princeton. WorkRise is a research to action network hosted by the Urban Institute, and they are supporting a number of important research and policy initiatives on related topics to this at a number of other universities and centers around the world, around the country. So I encourage you to take a look at their website, and I want to thank them here at the top for the support. In the interest of time, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the agenda and make introductions for presenters up front. We are going to hear first from my colleague and co-author, Ellora Derenoncourt. Ellora is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton and a member of the Industrial Relations section at Princeton Economics. She's also the founding director of the Program for Research on Inequality at Princeton University, which is focused on building a new community of scholars studying issues on inequality across a range of policy issues in the United States and around the world. Ellora's work has been widely featured in national media, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. Ellora is spending this academic year away from home. She's currently visiting SIPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Ellora will be presenting some work we've been conducting with Monica Essig-Aberg, currently a pre-doc at Princeton University, on the development of a new long-run database on state UI policies and rules, and how these rules can impact racial groups differently across states. Following Ellora's presentation, we'll have some time for audience Q&A, and then we'll hear from Hadi El-Zain. Hadi is currently a research scientist at Meta. He's working at the intersection of computer science with economics, policy, and societal concerns, and he's particularly interested in algorithmic fairness for machine learning in high stakes and policy relevant settings. He did his PhD at UPenn and his postdoc at Stanford before joining Meta. Hadi will be presenting new work on audit disparities by race, in particular among taxpayers claiming the earned income tax credit. Finally, we'll turn to a discussion between Damon Johns at the University of Chicago and Danny Yegan at UC Berkeley. Both Damon and Danny have recently returned to academic positions from service in the federal government. In Danny's case, from a term as chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget, and in Damon's case, from a term at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Hilary Hoynes, the director of the Opportunity Lab, will lead that discussion, and there will be opportunities for you all to ask questions through the Q&A function. Ellora, I'll turn things over here to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. So let me go ahead and share screen. All right. Can everyone see that? Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks, Claire, for getting us started. So I'm excited to share some new and ongoing work with you that we've been conducting with Monica Essig-Aberg at Princeton, who's tuning in from there. I'm based at Stanford this year and Claire in Paris, so it's been a multi-continent collaboration. So I'll be presenting State Unemployment Insurance Rules, a new long-run database. So the pandemic really threw into stark relief differences in eligibility and generosity in unemployment insurance benefits that stem from our federated system, namely the role of state rules. Federal pandemic unemployment compensation boosted unemployment benefits receipt in states that typically had lower levels of generosity and also expanded coverage to categories of workers who were not previously eligible. Recent research has also shown that state rules drive large gaps in racial differences in UI receipt among workers with identical work histories in the modern period. So what we're interested in is studying how state rules have affected equity in unemployment insurance over a very long run time span, and we're trying to get a view of the system as a whole. To do this, we are developing a new database of harmonized state unemployment insurance rules since the inception of the joint federal-state program that was part of the Social Security Act, began with the Social Security Act of 1935. And our database covers all 50 states, DC, the US Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, and includes around 80 years of state rules and changes in state rules since the late 1930s. In our database, we include over 60 both original state rules as well as our derived characterizations of these rules. Just to give you a sense, our database covers issues like monetary and non-monetary eligibility qualifications, weekly benefit formulas, including minima and maxima, duration minima and maxima, fund types, employer experience rating criteria, as well as coverage rules. So how do states deviate in terms of industry coverage from baseline federal standards? Or how does coverage evolve in terms of firm size or even the definition of who is an employee? We also include information on benefit extensions occurring during recessionary periods. Our anticipated public release for the database, if all goes well, is next academic year. So the way I'm going to structure this, very brief talk is I'll give you a bit more information on the sources that we're drawing on for the database, but the bulk of the talk is going to narrow in on one aspect and give you a sneak preview of both what's in the database and what we can do with it, focusing on specifically eligibility rules and their implications over time for different demographic groups. And then we'll tell you about some of our next steps and hopefully then get a chance for your feedback and questions. So the most important source for us is going to be a series of publications from the US Department of Labor. We're going to build the core of our database by digitizing a publication series called Significant Provisions of State Unemployment Insurance Laws. And this series is going to include key rules at the state level and record changes that occur over months within a year, all the way back to the late 1930s. So archived publications of this series date from that time period. We're going to supplement these core rules from the states with other information on the unemployment insurance system. Some of that will come from the Unemployment Insurance Financial Data Handbook. The handbook contains information on covered employment at the state by year level, average weekly wages among covered employees, and average benefits paid out, again, at the state by year level, going back to the late 1930s. We're going to supplement this with additional information we're digitizing from a series called Comparison of State Unemployment Insurance Laws that also goes back to the late 1930s and includes information on state rules around industry coverage, firm size, thresholds, as well as employer experience rating criteria. We will use these different sources to conduct some internal validity checks across rules derived from different sources, but we will also draw from other sources. For example, we will be comparing the database to information in the database created by Maxime Massenkoff, which focuses on state unemployment insurance laws in the period from the 1970s onwards. So on to our sneak preview focused on eligibility rules. Eligibility rules are some of the most important rules when it comes to understanding unemployment insurance policy. They govern who actually has access to benefits in the first place, so the extensive margin of unemployment insurance receipt. And the criteria for eligibility have demonstrated a lot of variability over time and across space. Just to give you a sense, the types of eligibility rules that appear on state books include the following. Fundamentally, many rules define eligibility based on what are known as base period earnings, or earnings in the year before the unemployment event. A rule that stipulates workers have base period earnings of a minimum dollar amount in order to be eligible, we call dollar rules. Other rules may stipulate base period earnings, a minimum of base period earnings, as a multiple of earnings in the worker's highest earning quarter. Those rules we call factor rules. There are also rules that stipulate a minimum amount for earnings in the highest earning quarter or high quarter rules. And then finally, sets of rules that stipulate a minimum number of weeks or quarters worked for eligibility in the base period. These are we call them time rules. It's important to note that many states, and the majority today, involve some combination of the above rules. So not a single condition, but multiple conditions. So just to give you a sense of the coverage of our database, both geographically and temporally, we'll show you a couple of images focusing on these different rule types. On the y-axis here is just the state or US territory name. And on the x-axis, months dating back to the late 1930s, so April 1937 until July 2020. And in teal here, you can see in these teal boxes, the prevalence of what we just defined as dollar eligibility rules. And in the blank squares, months and state combinations where there are no such rules. Here you can see the prevalence of factor eligibility rules across states and time periods. And you can see actually the growth in prevalence of these kinds of factor eligibility rules over time. Here you can see the prevalence of time eligibility rules. So these are rules that stipulate that earnings must occur in a minimum number of weeks or quarters. And then finally, as part of our derived characterizations of these rules, we looked at the cases where states have multiple conditions, what kind of logic connects those different conditions? For example, if there are two conditions, are they connected by an and statement or an or statement? Do individuals need to meet both requirements or just one of them? Once you have two or more rules, it's often the case that states use both and conditions and or conditions. So here you can see in the white squares states that state month combinations where there's only one condition that needs to be met. In the orange, these are conditions, these are state month combinations where there are multiple conditions that need to be met and they're connected by an and rule. In the teal, these are multiple condition rules where the conditions are connected by or. And then in the blue, you can see these combinations where there are multiple conditions and they're connected by both types of logic. What you can see in this image is that over time, the prevalence of rules that have multiple conditions has increased. I'm going to show you another view of that, which might be easier to see, which is just the number of states with one rule versus two or more rules. At the start of the system, state rules were simpler, and the majority of states, around 40, had really just one rule or one condition to establish eligibility for benefits. The number of states using just one rule has fallen dramatically over time, and correspondingly, those with two or more rules have increased to the vast majority of states. I'm now going to walk you through some concrete examples so that you all understand the language that's present in some of these rules, and to show really how they evolve over time and become more complex. One way that you can see that is the number of rules that I was able to even include on a single slide. So here are some examples from the 1940s. The first one is an example from California in the 1940s where to be eligible, applicants must have base period earnings that are at least $300. So this is a relatively simple rule. It's a dollar rule. It specifies a minimum amount of annual earnings required for eligibility. Take Michigan in the late 40s and early 1950s. This is a rule where base period earnings must meet the following criterion: that earnings occurred over 14 weeks of employment at more than $8 per week. So this is a combination of a time rule specifying the number of weeks over which earnings needed to have occurred, as well as a dollar amount that the minimum earnings need to be per week. And then finally, here we have Alaska in the 1940s, perhaps the most complicated of the rules. Fundamentally, this is a factor rule. So here, applicants must have base period earnings that are at least 25 times the weekly benefit amount. And here, the weekly benefit amount is itself defined in terms of as a factor of high quarter earnings, the highest earning quarter. Here, that's 1/20th of earnings in the highest earning quarter. And the state also specifies a minimum weekly benefit amount of $5. So keep this one in particular in mind. We're going to come back to that when we talk about applications, the empirical applications of the database. Moving forward in time, here are some examples from the 1980s and onwards, and you can already see I can't fit as many rules on the slide. They've become more complex. Here's an example from the late 80s, early 90s from Washington, D.C. For eligibility, applicants must have base period earnings equal to 1.5 their earnings in their highest earning quarter, So that's a factor rule. 2, they need to have earned at least $900 over 2 quarters, and 3, at least $300 in 1 quarter. In Florida, in the late 90s and early 2000s, to be eligible, once again, this factor rule appears. Earnings in the base period need to be 1.5 times earnings in the highest earning quarter. And there's also a dollar amount for the entire base period of at least $3,400. So keep these in mind as well. We're going to return to them. You might already be puzzling through them as I was as we encountered these rules, how one can figure out one's eligibility and how the different conditions end up progressively excluding more individuals. Okay, so I'm going to give you a sense of the empirical applications that we can use this database for by talking through how we use eligibility to study racial gaps using data from the census. So what we're going to do is combine our historical rules on eligibility with data from the 1940 to 2000 waves of the US Census and develop measures of racial gaps in what we're going to define as upper bound eligibility. So I'm going to define upper bound eligibility in the next slide, I believe. So just hang on tight for a second. Let me tell you a bit about the census data and how we're able to use it. So we're going to take these waves of the census and focus on individuals aged 16 through 64. So in the typical working years, particularly historically, when you had young, more teenagers working and in the labor force. And the census is going to provide consistently over this time period a measure of annual earnings that is pre-tax wage and salary income. The census also records weeks worked in the year before. And so this is often recorded, the variable that's available consistently over time is weeks worked in different bins of weeks. So for example, working 1 to 13 weeks, so that's working less than a quarter, 14 to 26 weeks, etc. And then we're going to incorporate at a broad level, there are some relevant federal exclusions. For example, agriculture and domestic work were not covered prior to 1978. So in general, individuals, I should say there are some very minor exemptions to this at the state level, but not very significant ones. So we're going to count those who, they may have had sufficient annual earnings or sufficient weeks worked to qualify according to certain state rules, but because of these exclusions from coverage, we're going to define them as not having eligible income prior to the 1980 census. So we're going to look at eligibility in 2 ways. We're going to identify individuals who are upper bound eligible, which I'm going to define in the next slide, as a share of those with positive earnings, so positive annual wage and salary income. And here we'll include in this group those who are in agriculture and domestic service to highlight the degree of exclusion that occurs through these industry exemptions. And then 2, we're going to look at share eligible just as out of the total group. So out of all individuals aged 16 through 64, irrespective of labor force status or employment. All right, so let me tell you about upper bound eligibility. So as you have seen at this point, the state rules can be quite complex, both historically, but certainly over time. So what we're going to do is develop what we call flattened rules that are going to give us a sense of upper bound eligibility for unemployment insurance benefits. For each rule, we're going to look at the text of the rule and derive what are the minimum annual earnings required for eligibility, as well as the minimum number of weeks worked needed for eligibility. So note, this is an upper bound eligibility measure, meaning that other criteria, workers may fail to meet other criteria and then be disqualified for benefits. So we're definitely not considering certain aspects of the rules, and we're not identifying exactly who is eligible, but we can use these minimum requirements to establish this notion of upper bound eligibility. We think this is a useful measure because one, we can harmonize it over time quite easily, and we can link it to what we observe in the census, namely annual earnings as well as weeks worked. This is going to allow us to compare across states and compare this measure across demographic groups. So now let me give you a couple examples of these flattened rules. So let's take Alaska from the 1940s. That was a rather complex rule. It was a factor rule. Eligibility in terms of annual earnings was a factor of weekly benefit amounts, which were themselves a factor of high quarter earning wages. The state also provided a minimum weekly benefit amount. We're going to use that to derive a minimum annual earnings amount, which is 25 times that $5 minimum weekly benefit amount. That's 125 in the base period. That's our definition of upper bound eligibility in this case. So if someone earns at least 125 in that year, we're going to call them upper bound eligible. And then it's true that they may be disqualified, but they might be disqualified based on observables that we don't have in the census. For example, how much they earned in their highest earning quarter. Here's a case of someone who meets upper bound eligibility, but gets disqualified by some of the further nuances in the rule. Someone who earned $500 in their highest earning quarter, but nothing in the rest of the base period. This person does not make 25 times their weekly benefit amount, which would be 25 times 500 over 20, or a total of 625 in the base period. Here's an example from the later period, Washington, D.C. in the late 80s and early 90s. This is a rule that combines dollar amounts and factor rules. Here, workers need to have earned 1.5 times their highest quarter earnings, earned at least 900 in 2 quarters and 300 in 1 quarter. We're going to flatten this rule again. The minimum amount of earnings required is 900 in the base period. So someone earning that amount could be eligible. If they earn less than that amount, they're not eligible. That's the notion of upper bound eligibility here. And then again, we've provided some cases where individuals might be disqualified if we could observe more information on how they earned those earnings and if they didn't meet the other conditions in the rule. For example, someone who earns $250 in each quarter, they make $1,000 overall, but they fail based on criteria 2 and 3. Similarly, someone who earns $1,000 in their highest earning quarter and $300 in the rest of the period, they're going to fail to meet criteria 1, even though they meet upper bound eligibility. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how we're going to apply these rules, what we can do is take, for example, a steel worker in 1940 who earned over $300 and worked at least 12 weeks. This is someone who would qualify in California, but not in Alaska, where since we know they earned $300, they're not necessarily earning the minimum amount they need to earn in Alaska, which is a multiple of their highest quarter earnings. An agricultural worker who earns $3,400 in a year does not qualify in almost any state in 1970, but may qualify in Florida in 2000. Again, this is a notion of upper bound eligible, so they may disqualify based on other observables that we can't see, but we know that anyone earning less than that amount would not qualify in the state of Florida in 2000. So once we apply, for each individual, the rule that applies in their state in terms of the flattened rule, minimum annual earnings and weeks worked, we can aggregate up to develop measures of upper bound eligibility for different demographics groups. We're going to look at Black men and Black women and non-Black men and non-Black women. And here I'm showing you upper bound eligibility from 1940 to 2000 out of those with positive earnings. So I'll note, right off the bat that many agricultural workers in the earlier period may have been sharecroppers or tenant farmers with earnings in terms of a share of farm profits that would not be recorded as wage and salary income. So they wouldn't be included in this denominator, which is why we're going to look at the other denominator, which includes everyone age 16 to 24 in that, 16 to 64 in that demographic group. Already what you see here is large gaps in upper bound eligibility. So starting in 1940, this short dashed line here is following Black women who have the lowest upper bound eligibility. Again, this is those with positive earnings, but because domestic workers were excluded, and this was a very important sector for Black women in the historical period, the vast majority of them are excluded from eligibility in this upper bound eligibility definition. The next group up is Black men, again, more likely to be in agricultural work. So even those who were farm laborers with annual wage and salary income, they would not be included. Upper bound eligibility for this group starts around 70%. Next up is non-Black women at around 80%, and then non-Black men at around 85 or close to 90%. Another striking thing here is the convergence in upper bound eligibility that seems to stem mainly from the industry coverage expansions when agricultural and domestic workers become eligible for UI in the late 1970s. However, one key fact that kind of emerges here is that the gap between non-Black men and the rest of the groups in terms of upper bound eligibility persists to the present. Okay, I'm going to show you one more figure here, which is the upper bound eligibility by demographic group out of the total group, so not conditioning on those with positive earnings. And some interesting facts emerge when we look at this measure of eligibility over time. Here we see that women, for the most part, are excluded in the early period, likely because they may have not been in the labor force altogether or had very low weeks in the labor force or weeks of employment. And over time, this group shows growth in upper bound eligibility that could, again, stem from both industry coverage expansions, but also rising labor force participation among women. Perhaps more informative is to look at men in this period who typically had very high labor force participation, but show significant gaps in upper bound eligibility. So Black men have less than half of them are upper bound eligible in the early period, around 60% of non-Black men. And then what's very striking about this is that since 1970, the upper bound eligible among all Black men aged 16 to 64 has actually declined over time, reaching the point where the share of Black men who are upper bound eligible is actually lower than that for non-Black women and Black women. And the gap with non-Black men is quite striking. So I've gone on for quite a long time. I'm going to wrap up now. This new database, we're really trying to capture the whole system and its evolution. UI is a federal state jointly administered system, meaning even to understand gaps in eligibility at a national level, we need to know the state rules. We need to know where someone lives and apply the rules in the state that they live in. That's something that we're doing with the database. And here we can derive using census data the shares of the population that are upper bound eligible. So we simplify the rules, derive some minimum requirements, and then apply that using the observables we have in census. Some of the future directions of this work include looking at these differences at the state level. So which states tend to be more expansive in terms of their upper bound eligibility, which ones are more restrictive. We can look at the relationship between state rules and their evolution over time and income inequality in the state and poverty. And then finally, one thing that we think will be particularly policy relevant is to conduct counterfactuals around rule simplification using actual historical rules that tended to be simpler. If we kind of rewind state rules and went back to simpler rules, how would that affect eligibility and generosity at the state level and in the nation overall? And then finally, of course, we want to complete our database and send it out for public release so that other researchers can make use of it as well. Thanks so much. We have a question from Hillary about, do we see a role for benefit levels as well as eligibility? and any variation across states in what groups of jobs are included or excluded. So that's a great question. So absolutely. In terms of benefit levels at the individual level, we would really need a lot more information from each individual about their work history, the kind of thing that's available in applications in UI data, but those are only available for the modern period. What we can do, however, is look at how state benefit rules, especially their maximum and minimum benefits, correlate with measures of income inequality and poverty over time across the states for different demographic groups as well. And so that's something that we plan to look at. So it's more asking how state policy might affect inequality or poverty rates, knowing what we know about minimum benefits or maximum benefits. And then we do have information that we're still collecting on state deviations from federal exemptions. So there were a couple of states that included agricultural workers and domestic workers with some, firm size requirements as well. So those kinds of deviations from state policy, they're always in the positive direction, meaning expanding coverage. We're currently collecting those and can use those. And have you had a chance yet to see how changes in the geographic distribution of Black and white workers shapes these aggregate patterns? That's a great question, and it's something that we're going to look at next. Thank you. One last question on state funding of the programs, and that's different information than what's captured in the rules. Can we use that information as well? Absolutely. So we're also collecting state fund types.